Thank you, Mark. I'm very honored, and it's very flattering to be in such good company in the previous winners of the Paolucci Bagehot Award. It's also a great honor to receive this award from the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, an organization which for more than 60 years has done wonderful work in sustaining the core principles of American civic life. I also wish to extend condolences to the ISA community for the recent loss of a great lady and a great scholar, Anne Paolucci. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge that Henry Paolucci was a stalwart defender of American national sovereignty. I hope that he would have been pleased in presenting this award to me, as pleased as I am in receiving it. I'm going to proceed as follows. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call Philadelphia sovereignty. Second, I'm going to examine the ideas of the Global Governance Project, which challenges Philadelphian sovereignty. And third, I will move from ideas to action and look at some of the actual activities of the globalists. And then fourth, I will examine the significance of this conflict between constitutional government and global governance. Now, sovereignty is defined by most scholars and most people as Westphalian, embodied in the nation state and going back to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, and that's true to an extent. But when I was working on the book and thinking of writing, coming up with some concepts, I realized that Americans don't think of themselves as Westphalians. They don't say, oh, we're defending Westphalian sovereignty. Americans think of sovereignty in the sense of we, the people of the United States of America, the opening words of the Constitution of the United States, written, of course, in Philadelphia. Hence, I came up with the term Philadelphian sovereignty. Also, of course, rhymes with Westphalian. But what is Philadelphian sovereignty, of course, means the people are sovereign, but through a constitution. And the core, the twin pillars of that Philadelphian sovereignty are liberty and consent. So we do have majority rule, but majority rule is limited through a constitution and the whole system of separation of powers, of federalism, of limited government. So this is Philadelphia sovereignty. A lot of times people, get hung up on, are we a republic or a democracy? We're a compound regime, a regime that is both liberal and democratic, or constitutional and republican, or liberal and republican. You could use any of these terms. And Alexander Hamilton used the term representative democracy. So we're a government that is based on majority rule and consent, but that is limited by a constitution, hence this compound regime. Now, one of the major charges that the American colonists raised against King George III in the Declaration of Independence was about sovereignty. I'll read that charge. He, that's George III, has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. Now, of course, the Constitution he was referring to, obviously, in 1776 was the British Constitution, the ancient Constitution. But that concept is the same. There was some foreign jurisdiction in which that was going to have authority over us. We're going to examine now the ideas and practices of those who, in our time, have combined with others to subject us or attempt to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. Well, ideas have consequences, as we learned long ago from an early ISI scholar, Richard Weaver. So let's examine some of the ideas. Let's start with that, of the Global Governance Project. These ideas are not hard to find. You don't have to go be invited to a secret Bilderberger conspiracy meeting or the Trilateral Commission or any of this stuff. It's right out in the open. They're right up on the websites of the UN, the European Union, the American Bar Association, the deans of most law schools and American universities, leading American foundations. It's all there on the internet. And people are not talking about world government anymore. They're talking about global governance. Not a government, but this form of transnational governance. So let's look at four people, just some quick views of theirs, who have given ideas to this concept of global governance. Strobe Talbot is currently the president of the Brookings Institution, major think tank in Washington. He's former Deputy Secretary of State And as a journalist for Time magazine in the 1990s, Talbot wrote an article in which he welcomed supranational political authority. He said, quote, "I'll bet that within the next 100 years, nationhood as we know it will be obsolete, and all states will recognize a single global authority." He concluded by saying that this devolution of power, upwards toward the supranational and downwards toward autonomous units of administration, is basically a positive phenomenon. Harold Koh is currently, today, he's the chief legal advisor of the U.S. State Department. In other words, he advises the president on what international law is. He's the American spokesman on international law. He was dean of the Yale Law School. He gave a major speech last week at Georgetown Law, so he's a major figure in international law. Well, Harold Koh wrote, quote, "Domestic courts must play a major role in coordinating U.S. domestic constitutional rules with the rules of foreign and international law to advance the broader development of a well-functioning international judicial system." Well, think about that for a minute. American courts can't coordinate the law from international law. They won't have much influence over international law and foreign law, but they can coordinate American law. They can only coordinate American law. It's the influence that American courts have. So in other words, this, by definition, if this is true, if we coordinate American law with foreign international law, he would have to subordinate American law to foreign international law. It's the only way this would logically work. The fourth person I'm going to talk about for a minute is Anne Marie Slaughter. She was head of the Office of Policy and Planning, or the third person, at the U.S. State Department during the first 2 years of the Obama administration. Anne Marie Slaughter wrote that she argued that nation states should cede a degree of sovereignty to what she calls transnational networks. Vertically, this is a direct quote, nations should cede sovereign authority to supranational institutions, such as the International Criminal Court. So vertically, there'd be something above the nation, supranational institution. Slaughter maintains that such transparent networks, quote, this is a quote from Slaughter, can perform many of the functions of a world government, legislation, administration, and adjudication without the form, thereby creating an effective global rule of law. Well, she was the person in policy planning, the key think tank of the State Department, first 2 years of the Obama administration. But there's also a Republican I'm going to mention here, Richard Haass. He's currently the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was a special assistant to President George H.W. Bush, and during the administration of George W. Bush, he served as director of policy and planning, same position as Slaughter. And Richard Haass says that it's time to rethink sovereignty. He argues that sovereignty is not only becoming weaker in reality, but it needs to become weaker. States should want to weaken sovereignty, he says, in order to protect themselves. Okay, those are some of the ideas. Now, before proceeding, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. I'm not talking against international law in general or against international relations. And I draw a clear distinction in the book between transnationalism and globalism and internationalism. There's nothing wrong with having international treaties. International means inter, between nations. So the United States has a NATO treaty. We get together with Western Europe. We're going to defend ourselves. That's an international treaty. There's nothing wrong with that. There's plenty of trade treaties. Same thing. I am criticizing in the book supranational, something above the nation state, or transnational, across or within. Think of the transcontinental railway. It's something across nations, goes within nations. So the term transnational is used, and that's distinguished from international. Well, okay, those are some of the ideas. Let's dig into the weeds a little bit now. What are global laws? Now, global or transnational laws, not international laws, right? Okay, so what do global laws and global rules mean? Because people are always saying we need global rules for this. And where are the twin pillars of Philadelphian sovereignty? Liberty, consent. Where do they come into all of this? Okay, I'll give you one example from national security policy and one example from domestic policy. Let's look at the laws of war. The United States is a party to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. The original Geneva Conventions